Good evening, everyone. I'm Trey Johnson, and welcome to this spooky edition of Museum After Hours. Tonight, the Kansas Historical Society's very own Lauren Gray will be delivering this program all the way from San Antonio, Texas, since she is currently attending the Western History Association Conference. Lauren is the head of reference with the State Archives and earned her master's degree in early U.S. history from the University of New Mexico. As you can see, we're taking a darker turn this evening to focus on the art of dying, reflections on death in 19th century America. The United States experienced profound cultural and social change during this time period, and nowhere was that more evident than in the practices surrounding death. Attitudes towards death and the deceased shifted radically, especially in the period following the Civil War. I hope you're ready to hear some spooky stories of body snatching, live burials, embalming, and more just in time for Halloween. I'm sure this topic will generate plenty of questions, so please be sure to type those questions in the chat or use the Q&A button as they come to you, and after the program, we'll get to as many as we can. So let's all give a warm welcome to Lauren Gray.
Thank you, Trey, so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me at Museum After Hours. Since I started at the agency, I've been looking forward to doing one of these. So I hope I'm really going to embrace it, and I hope it goes well. So
I know it will.
I'm super excited. I love this topic, and just give me a moment so I can figure out how to share my screen. All right, everyone should be seeing The Art of Dying, Reflections on Death in 19th Century America. So let me make sure. Oops, sorry. It worked so perfectly in the practice. Give me just a second. Okay, then, sorry. Interview taskbar. And I'm very sorry, it worked perfectly, and now it has decided to not work perfectly. Why? Oh, don't do this to me.
Would you like me to operate it?
Do you see it?
We're almost there.
I'm going to click away from it and get my notes up. So hopefully, do you still only see The Art of Dying?
I see the notes.
No! Gosh, goodness. Oh my gosh. I don't know why it is. I'm having a struggle moment. I'm so sorry, y'all. This really did go perfectly in practice. If Trey has to run it, that is fine. I would just prefer to do it myself. Okay, let me see. Trey, can I ask you to run it? I don't know why it's not working. I'm so sorry.
You can pull up your notes and then just let me know and I'll advance each slide.
All right, sounds good.
In 1 sec, I've got it up here.
Well, at least I don't have to stare at my face the entire time that I'm doing this. That's always a little awkward. I am ready whenever you are.
All right, yeah.
Thank you so much. So I'll say, you saw it in my notes. I reminded myself to thank you for the kind introductions and greetings from sunny San Antonio. Like Trey said, I'm attending the Western History Association conference this week. It is my first big conference post-COVID. So it's been great to go out and see what's been going on in the history world. And I actually just came from a session called The Place of the Body. So I could have no better warm up for me, at least, to set the stage for this presentation. And I have to say, I heard people were dying to hear this talk. So I've been boning up for it all month. I'm sorry, I know I'm killing it already. As Trey said, my name is Lauren Gray, and I'm the head of reference for the Kansas Historical Society State Archives. I've been with the State Archives since 2018, almost 4 years to the day, actually. I think my start date was October 18th. Most of my job involves running the reference room, handling research requests, and facilitating access to our collections. But occasionally, I also get the opportunity to do outreach and presentations like I'm doing tonight. So like I said, I'm super excited about being here. I'm also an historian by training. I did my graduate work in early US history, so I'm very excited also about tonight's theme, Death in 19th Century America. But first of all, since you all dug in, and before we get started, I wanted to put in a little plug for the State Archives. Since October is American Archives Month, it seems particularly appropriate to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do, especially while the museum is closed for renovation. I promise this will only take a minute, and then we'll get back to our scheduled program. Slide, please. So, like I said, I am with the State Archives, which is a division of the Kansas Historical Society. The Historical Society was founded in 1875 by the Kansas Newspaper and Editors Association, who recognized the importance of Kansas's role in the Civil War and who wanted to preserve the history of the state. Obviously, since it was founded by newspapermen, newspapers were one of the first items we collected. We became the official trustee of the state's history in 1879, and the State Archives was written into statute in the early 1900s. Our collection started out as a bookshelf in the corner of the state auditor's office and has grown into the wonderful, beautiful, renovated building, soon to be renovated building that we have today on the west edge of Topeka. Today, we have several miles of materials, including over 50,000 reels of microfilm, 500,000 photographs, and 25,000 maps, just to name a few. Our collections include newspapers, genealogy research materials, non-current state government records like old governor's papers, business records, diaries, architectural prints, and much more. For example, this photo on the screen of the cute little toilet paper roll demons comes from Oakley, Kansas, and it is in our collection on Kansas Memory. I assume they were dressing up for Halloween and hopefully nothing else, although that probably looks like some scene out of COVID when everyone rushed to get toilet paper. I don't know. But the State Archives remains open during the museum's renovation. We hold public research hours Tuesday to Friday and the last Saturday of the month if you'd like to come in and do research on your family history or learn more about the history of your community. We also have many, many resources available online. Our website, kshs.org, which will be linked at the end of this presentation, and maybe we can pop it into the chat at some point, holds information about the Historical Society, information about our different divisions, including what other events are hosted by the museum, as well as information about our archaeology department and cultural resources division. The State Archives online catalog is also available through the website, as well as several indices for research. We also offer free, limited access to both Ancestry.com and newspapers.com through our website. And like I see, free for Kansas residents. If you have any questions about researching at the State Archives, you can contact our reference staff, and our contact information will be available at the end of the presentation. You're also welcome to ask me any general questions about research at the State Archives at the end of the presentation. I'm happy to answer anything. It doesn't have to be related to death. So slide, please. So now that I've buried you, I think that's the last one, I'm sorry. Now that I've buried you in information about the State Archives, let's get to the main event, death. It's the reason for the season. We're entering into a very spooky time of year. The sun sets earlier, the nights are longer, and winter, as they say, is coming. There are many fall and autumnal celebrations that have historically occurred at the end of this harvest season when the days get shorter. Many early communities commemorated the turning of the seasons. The early Celts had Samhain, which was a precursor to Halloween. To the Greeks, the darkening of days meant Persephone had returned to the underworld, bringing 6 months of winter. Today, we mark the seasons with holidays and religious observations. In America, we celebrate Halloween. In America and Mexico, we commemorate Dia de los Muertos and All Souls Day. And in India, and for Indian Americans, they celebrate Diwali, the festival of lights that chases away the darkness. And that is just to name a few. Since we are leaving the abundance of summer behind and entering the decline of the year, and with Halloween almost upon us, it seems appropriate to consider death and to consider the many journeys of the body after death. Also, I wanted to give a quick plug for my colleague and our collections archivist, Katie Keck-Eisens. Her talk on the history of spiritualism will happen next month on November 4th, and she will be discussing the late 19th and early 20th century conceptions of what happens to us spiritually when we die, and the history of the religious phenomenon of spiritualism. I cannot tell you how excited I am to hear her talk. She'll talk about spiritualism's connections to the Civil War and World War I, and its relation to the battle of words between the creator of Sherlock Holmes and the greatest magician of all time. So please tune in next month on November 4th to hear Katie's talk. And also, before we get started, I wanted to give a quick disclaimer. We're talking about death. Some of the images that I use in this presentation might be a little unsettling, so don't be unsettled. And let us go on. So talking about death in the 19th century, I love this image. It is actually on the screen. It's from Punch magazine in 1862. It is actually talking about the deadly fashions of the period, but I love it just because it really represents the lengths that people will go to make themselves look fabulous. Beauty is pain, pain is beauty. But in America, being more serious now, the 19th century was a period of profound change. And that's why I focused on the 19th century for today's talk. America was a relatively new nation in the 19th century, and its people were obsessed with creating their own American identity. Anyone who is a student of American history will recognize that this creation was, more often than not, a violent and tumultuous process. And also, if the history of the 19th century teaches us anything, it is that death is a potent force for shaping political and social narratives. Also, social perceptions of this cultural change were very well documented in the 19th century. Many participants left diaries and memoirs of their observation, and correspondence was plentiful. Relatively high literacy rates, especially in the middle and upper classes, and a desire to preserve their remarks for posterity has ensured that the period is well documented for historians. Experiences of death and cultural relations surrounding death varied widely among cultural groups during the period. I chose to focus on the experiences of middle and upper class Americans. There are so many powerful stories and narratives about death in the 19th century for all cultural groups who lived in America at the time, enslaved or free African Americans, immigrant experiences, indigenous experiences. Sadly, I could not address them all in 45 minutes. I hope you will forgive me, but enjoy the talk anyway. Slide, please. So death was a multifaceted and complex phenomenon in 19th century America. When talking about death, the 19th century American would understand that you're also talking about the afterlife. What happens not only to your soul, but to your body when you die? To the 19th century American, both the corporeal and non-corporeal entity needed to be considered at time of death. Before the Civil War, Americans had a very clear set of beliefs of what happened in death. And at the crux of those beliefs was the concept of the good death. The concept of the good death came from the tradition of ars moriendi, or the art of dying, which was a core tenet in the Christian faith. It involved giving up one's soul willingly, even gladly, upon death, resisting the devil and foregoing the temptations of the living. The practice of the good death came out of this tradition, and by the 19th century, it had become a core cultural belief to most 19th century Americans. A good death reflected on and gave meaning to the life lived, and served as a predicate for the quality of your soul's afterlife. Protestant doctrine also dictated that the body itself would rise in the next spiritual life, which presented a serious problem for soldiers and civilians literally torn apart by war, but we'll get to that later. Drew Gilpin Faust, the president of Harvard and preeminent scholar on the subject of death in the Civil War, wrote, well, she put it best when she said, to the 19th century American, it was work to die, to know how to approach and endure life's last moments. Of all living things, only humans consciously anticipate death. The consequent need to choose how to behave in its face, to worry about how to die, distinguishes us from other animals, end quote. It was well understood by contemporaries that there were exact steps to be met in order to achieve a good death. As one wartime pamphlet extolled, quote, "Death is not to be regarded as a mere event in our history. It is not like a birth or a marriage or a painful accident or a lingering illness. Death has an importance that cannot be estimated by men. Here on earth, everything is changing and unsettled. Beyond the grave, our condition is unchangeable." And at the crux of the good death was the ors mori, the hour of death, in which the dying person's final words and actions were to be witnessed, assessed, analyzed, and interpreted for those not present to witness the moments leading up to death. A person's conduct upon his or her hour of death anticipated the condition he or she would arise in the spiritual afterlife. The deceased's final words were considered to be of paramount importance. Final words were considered to be the unadulterated truth. As the dying person staring into the maw of death had no need to lie and would want to enter heaven with a clear conscience. Drew Gilpin Faust posited that final words, quote, "served as a lingering exhortation and a persisting tie between the living and the dead," end quote, which preserved the connection between family members and those who had passed on. A soldier's death away from family and friends robbed the survivors of a critical component of the good death. So we see on the screen an image from the State Archives here that depicts a good death from the period. The dying person is surrounded by grieving family, but he faces his upcoming demise with a placid and one could even say noble acceptance. This is how 19th century Americans would have perceived the good death, and they would have recognized the symbolism behind these elements. Slide, please. The advent of the Civil War entirely upended American life, socially, economically, and politically. And with over 620,000 military deaths, cultural practices surrounding death and dying came under intense pressure. At the same time, technological improvements in photography enabled photographers to capture the war and its bloody aftermath in strikingly honest and gruesome intimacy. War photographers like Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan captured the essence of the psychological and physiological destruction of modern warfare. Their images brought the war home to an increasingly disenchanted and traumatized home front. Upon public exhibition of Gardner's photographs from the Battle of Antietam in 1862, the New York Times wrote, quote, "If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along the streets, he has done something very like it," end quote. Today, we're very desensitized to images of death, but that was not the case in the 19th century. Even though death was prevalent, you would not see it on a photograph walking down the street. As Faust writes, the seemingly wanton destruction and deformations of soldiers' bodies, quote, "assaulted their conceptions of how life should end," end quote. The gravesite itself marks the place of one's own and for a person's family. Your gravesite is your space. The physical body in that space speaks to the concept of home and kin, which were very powerful factors in the 19th century experience, regardless of your cultural group. And the Civil War's disruption of that space challenged, Faust argues, quote, "their most fundamental assumptions about life's value and meanings," end quote. And slide, please. Soldiers and civilians were keenly aware of this cultural assault. Diarist Sarah Morgan, pictured here on the screen, wrote extensively of her experiences during the war, and she was a keen observer of people and places. She wrote, "These poor soldiers are dying awfully. These poor wretches lay uncovered on the ground in every stage of sickness. Cousin Will saw one lying dead without a creature by to notice when he died. Another, a mere skeleton, lay in the agonies of death too, but he evidently had kind friends, for several were gathered around him, holding him up and fanning him, while his son leaned over him, crying aloud. It is heartbreaking to see them die here like dogs, with no one to say Godspeed. The Catholic priest went to see someone some time ago, and going near one who lay in bed, said some kind thing, when the man burst into tears and cried, "Thank God, I have heard one kind word before I die." You'll notice that I've highlighted portions in the text where Morgan reflects on the experience of dying and directly relates it back to the concept of the good death. These dying soldiers lamented their death alone and away from their loved ones. They were very much aware that they were breaking away from these cultural beliefs and practices. And I think that terrified them. In as much as anyone is terrified by their upcoming death, they were terrified that their words were not being witnessed. Their family was not by their side. And as the war dragged on and the death toll mounted, civilians and soldiers alike became increasingly distraught at the idea of soldiers dying away from home and family. As Sarah Morgan went on to write, quote, "We can only die once. We can suffer 1,000 deaths with suspense and uncertainty," end quote. Families sought to mitigate the anxiety of this separation and death by reluctantly embracing the practice of embalming, the practice of preserving the body, in an attempt to continue to meet the needs of the good death. Slide, please. The purpose of embalming was to sanitize and prepare the deceased corpse for display or transportation, and to preserve the body for the afterlife. Embalming, of course, was not a new art in the 19th century. Egyptians had practiced embalming as early as 2600 BCE, and many other cultures utilized a form of embalming for religious or cultural purposes. There were also many early ways to temporarily preserve bodies for transport and display. Ice-lined coffins were popular for displaying the body, but during the hottest months of the year, this wasn't sufficient, or the ice might not be available. They would also line caskets with lead, which could then be filled with liquor. Another way practiced by the British Army and Navy since at least the 18th century was to pack the body of a person who died overseas into a barrel of liquor, usually brandy or rum, which are natural preservatives, for transport back to England. In fact, rumor had it, some disreputable tavern keepers would recycle the liquor from these body barrels onto their unsuspecting patrons, and it is believed this is where the term rot gut booze comes from. One famous recipient of the liquor barrel treatment was Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, the hero of Trafalgar, who was killed by a sniper during the battle. His body was packed in a barrel of liquor, probably brandy, with a mix of camphor and myrrh, and he was shipped back to England for burial. Along the way, the brandy was siphoned off and replaced with fresh. I do not know if anyone had a taste of cask strength Admiral Nelson, which, by the way, is an amazing brand name for spirits, trademark. But 2 months after being tossed at sea in a barrel of brandy, it was reported that upon his arrival in England, his body emerged perfectly preserved, quote, "to the great surprise of all," end quote. Obviously, this special treatment was reserved for individuals at the top of the social ladder, the senior officers, as it was an expensive and time-consuming method of preservation. The barrel pictured on this slide is known as a leaguer, and it's an example of the type of barrels used to store bodies. Obviously, they had to be quite large. This disparity of experience persisted into the American Civil War. And I should point out that that top image is just a cartoon I found. I thought it was really cute. I probably shouldn't say that. It gave me a chuckle, so I included it. But ideally, that is not how the body would emerge from the barrel. I do not believe Admiral Nelson looked like that when they opened it. But moving on, not to disgrace his memory. Slide, please. The Civil War sparked an interest in embalming for public use. Many new chemical compositions and procedures had come into use in the years before the war, largely used by medical colleges for the preservation of corpses for dissection and study. But during the Civil War, civilians also started using embalming, and the reasons are obvious. Beloved sons, husbands, and fathers died hundreds of miles from home, and their families wanted the return of their loved ones in the form that they remembered them, to the best of the embalmer's ability. To preserve the bodies, early morticians used arsenic-based fluids before the advent of formaldehyde in the 1890s. Early embalming, therefore, had a varying success rate. The story goes that when President Lincoln's body finally reached its destination in May of 1865 for his burial, the former president had a rather unpleasant death-like look on his decomposing face. That's possibly also what presidents look like at the end of their terms. I've heard it's a very stressful job. The process of embalming and shipping the bodies of loved ones was usually only accessible for those with means, as we saw before, usually officers, although there were exceptions. One of Washington, D.C.'s preeminent embalmers, Thomas Holmes, charged $100 per body, and I think that's about $2,500 today. A Texas soldier commented bitterly on the disparity when he wrote, quote, "The officers get the honor, you get nothing. They get a monument, you get a hole in the ground and no coffin," end quote. The death of loved ones, regardless of class, was particularly disruptive to the 19th century view of the good death. This was mitigated in part by reclaiming a loved one's body, either through embalming and shipping his remains home, or by traveling to the battlefield itself to comb through the fallen soldiers to find a loved one, because physically confirming the presence of the body also confirmed that your loved one was deceased. Casualties were continually misidentified or simply never reported during the war. Some loved ones just never came home, and this was particularly true in the Confederacy in the later years of the war. Soldiers were intensely aware of and concerned about misidentification. Soldiers would write their names on slips of paper so that upon their death, the slip of paper would be discovered in a pocket or in a hat band. Likewise, sometimes comrades of the deceased would take the time to identify their fallen friend and give their friend a better burial. In some instances, the deceased's comrades would write to the family and inform them of the burial site. It was not unheard of for a family member to travel down to the grave, exhume the body, and then ship it home for burial. This happened with such frequency at Gettysburg that during the hot months of August and September, remember the battle occurred in July, the Union commander disallowed exhumations for the, quote, health of the community, end quote. A brisk trade in coffin services, disinfectants, and deodorizers also proliferated around battlefields during the war, some merchants going so far as to hand out brochures advertising their services to civilians arriving on the field after the battle. Embalming was important, not just for preventing decay, but also to maintain in the deceased as lifelike an appearance as possible. This was a core component in the good death ritual. Drew Gilpin Faust wrote that when the family witnessed the deceased resting in an easy and sleep-like repose, it was a, quote, means of resisting death's terror, end quote. And she goes on to say, resisting its reality, it, quote, it offered a way of blurring the boundary between life and death, end quote. Spiritually, the deceased was ready to, quote, awaken in a new life to come, end quote. Embalmers themselves, while they provided an important service for the grieving public, were often viewed with suspicion. Embalmers would follow armies, especially during campaigns, in order to sell their services in a manner much like ambulance chasers today. The public's dislike of embalmers came from the embalmers' intimacy with the dead, as well as their commodification of death. Also, while these embalmers operated under permits granted by the Army, they were not sponsored by the Army. So there was little, if any, oversight of their practices. You do not want to open up the coffin at the other end of the line and discover a decomposing body. That is not the service that you paid for, and that truly and significantly disrupts your grieving process. Quality control was non-existent, and some embalmers were accused of taking dead soldiers from the battlefield without the family's permission, embalming them, and then holding the family responsible for the embalming cost, using the corpse as collateral. Slide, please. The period after the Civil War brought greater demand for knowledge of anatomy and the body. The staggering death toll and number of casualties of the Civil War highlighted the need to improve the American medical educational experience. Part of this experience was the study of anatomy, which both physicians and the public alike agreed was critical to the practice of medicine. However, much to the doctor's misfortune, the demand for bodies for study and dissection far outstripped the supply. And I just want to take a moment and look at this slide. This image is actually from an artist operating in the late 18th century, but I felt it was still very appropriate for the subject. And obviously there are no photographs of people robbing bodies. If you call Egyptian tomb archaeology grave robbing, maybe, I don't know, probably shouldn't say that. But grave robbing, Ambrose Bierce wittily said, wittily, is that a word? Grave, a noun, a place in which the dead are laid to await the coming of the medical students. So people at the time were very much aware that this practice happened. So slide, please. Post-mortem catch-22. Writing as early as 1824, Dr. Thomas Wakeley bemoaned what he saw as the catch-22 of studying anatomy. Quote, "If a surgeon commit an error in the practice of his profession from a deficient knowledge of anatomy, the patient or sufferer may recover heavy damages," he would sue the doctor in essence. "It is perfectly right to visit such gross ignorance with severe punishment, but what we do complain of is the ridiculous anomaly of first making laws to punish medical practitioners if they do not possess a knowledge of their profession, and subsequently passing other laws which deprive them of the only source from whence it is possible that knowledge can be obtained. In short," he said, "if dead bodies cannot be procured, it will be impossible for the pupils to learn anatomy, and without anatomy, neither surgeons nor physicians can practice with the least prospect of benefiting their patients." With the proliferation of medical schools, especially after the Civil War, it became difficult to obtain medical specimens for anatomical studies. While some people did freely donate or sell their own remains to medical programs, and other bodies were procured from state-sponsored executions of convicts, it was nowhere near the number required for successful study. Medical schools, therefore, turned to other means to collect their subjects. Those who steal the dead have historically gone by many names: body snatchers, grave robbers, ghouls, resurrectionists, fishermen, snatches, grabs, and sack-em-up men, just to name a few. Their victims, the bodies, were called things or stiffs. Understanding the 19th century view on death and what happened to the body after life helps us to understand the vitriol exhibited towards body snatchers and how anathema body snatching was to the prevailing cultural beliefs about death. A few contracts actually do exist between medical schools and individual professional body snatchers, and correspondence and diaries from the time indicate close relationships between body snatchers and their patrons, who were usually instructors at the various colleges. Instructors were also body snatchers themselves on occasion. In one instance, a student became a body snatcher during medical school to defray the cost of tuition and continued the practice after graduation. A body could cost anywhere between $5 and $100, depending on supply and demand. And the orders for bodies could be surprisingly large. Upon the arrest of Dr. Henry LeCaron in 1878, he and his associates were filling an order for 70 bodies for a local medical school, 60 of which had already been procured at the time of his arrest. So we can see how this would be a very lucrative career, and not only in monetary value. One grave robber, George Christian, was known to be very well dressed, and as it turns out, most of his clothes he acquired secondhand, and I suppose that really redefines thrifting. So if you're a body snatcher, how do you find the body? There are instances of professional grave robbers going to mourn at the grave and dropping flowers nearby to flag the correct site for later. Many grave robbers worked in close relation with the medical industry, so they would be aware of who was recently deceased and where and when the body would be interred. Remember, they needed the body to be as fresh as possible. Other times, they would go on the hunt for bodies. As professional grave robber George Christian wrote in his diary in November 1873, quote, Dr. Schlimmer, who was one of his many partners in crime, who appears frequently in the diary, went out riding this afternoon, hoping to see a funeral, but were not so fortunate as to meet one. I waited 2 hours near Ebenezer Church, but did not find anything, end quote. Ebenezer's must have been a popular spot because 2 days later, Christian writes that he succeeded in getting a subject from the church's cemetery or graveyard. Notwithstanding the imprudent decision to record illicit activities in his diary, which, by the way, the diary was later used as evidence in court when Christian was put on trial for his grave robbing activities, among other charges. Christian's diary reveals both the complexity and scope that the grave robbing industry required. Grave robbing was not Christian's day job. Ironically, he worked as a clerk in the Surgeon General's office in DC, but his diary reveals that he and his accomplices were active almost every night in procuring subjects for local colleges. Grave robbers also haunted the poor and disenfranchised neighborhoods. Christian collected 2 subjects from the, quote, dead house at the poorhouse, end quote, that same month. Grave robbers would steal subjects indiscriminately, and Christian was known to rob from both the local potter's field and more illustrious graveyards. Christian also noted in his diary that he attended many executions of criminals and would later note if he was able to secure the subject after the fact. Body snatchers would also bribe or purchase bodies from church sextons and undertakers. During both the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, unclaimed bodies on battlefields provided a surplus of material. And unfortunately, African American cemeteries were targeted much more frequently than white cemeteries. Antebellum physicians in the South, not surprisingly, did use bodies than white bodies. This extended to purchasing enslaved people to carry out the body snatching. There was little recourse for the Black communities in these instances, but some free Black communities did sponsor petitions condemning the practice. Slide, please. So if you're a body snatcher, how do you go about robbing a grave? Please don't use this as an instructional manual. In 1818, Dr. John Sheen, a prominent Irish physician who, incidentally, was one of the first to diagnose apneas, wrote, quote, in the work of exhumation, the upper part of the grave is cleared, the corresponding part of the lid of the coffin is torn up, and then by means of a noose round its neck, the body is extracted by main force, end quote. I have to say here, on a break from the narrative, I felt very sorry for the person sitting next to me on the plane, reading over my shoulder as I wrote this on the way here. Like I said, this is not an instructional manual for grave robbing for dummies. Anyway, the body, once exhumed, would then be tied up in a sack or folded into a box, although there were examples of body snatchers propping up a fresh corpse in a wagon and speaking to it as if it were a real, albeit drunk person, in order to escape suspicion. Apparently, that ruse worked from time to time. Apparently, the popular image of a coffin fully disinterred is inaccurate. In reality, body snatchers would do the deed as quickly as possible without leaving a trace. The grave should appear completely undisturbed in order to protect the illicit activities of the grave robbers. And as we see in this example from the Topeka Daily Capital in 1888, a disturbed grave was a newsworthy event. And I'm not going to read that, but email me if you want a copy of it. To that aim, another report of grave robbing states that a canvas would be spread around the grave to catch the dirt the snatchers dug up so it wouldn't flatten the grass. Then the robbers would dig down to the head of the coffin with wooden implements so it wouldn't sound against any stones or rocks in the earth. When the coffin was reached, 2 large hooks would be lowered and hooked at the lid. Then enough force would be applied to break off a portion of the lid to allow the body to be exhumed. Sacking was placed around to dampen the sound. The body was hauled out by the neck, stripped of its grave clothes most of the time, which were reburied, and the ground was replaced to its original condition. All of that would ideally be done within an hour, although it usually took considerably longer. Once exhumed, bodies would occasionally be shipped over state lines. However, with what frequency it is impossible to determine. Sometimes the bodies would be packaged in barrels, sometimes soaked in whiskey, as we saw, to delay decomposition. Bodies were also folded tightly into boxes, which some practitioners oddly said that they preferred, as the head got knocked about when shipped in a barrel. The box would be about 2 by 3 feet, the quote, legs and thighs flexed, and the head resting on the chest, end quote. The body would be packed in sawdust to prevent odor and presumably to collect any seepage. 2 bodies could be packed in a slightly larger box, and in 1873, the going rate was about $25 per specimen to mail a corpse. However, it was much easier, not to mention less risky, to acquire specimens closer to home. Also, there is some indication that the advent of rail travel encouraged interstate shipping of specimens, although laws were quickly put in place to deter the shipment of cadavers by rail. Slide, please. So, coming a little bit closer to home, Topeka had its own body snatching scandal in the 1890s. It involved the Kansas Medical College, which was founded in 1889 and held its first classes in September of 1890. The school enrolled 22 students in its first year, and in 1891, the college had climbed 33 students, 6 of whom, I should note, were women. The Kansas Medical College prescribed the required medical curricula at the time, which included, as we know, courses in anatomy and dissection. In the course catalog, which I have pictured here on the screen, the school guaranteed incoming students that the quote, the school of dissection has demonstrated that abundant material can be obtained for dissection free. And because of that, anatomical material is abundant and furnished to the student without extra charge, end quote. As the kids say these days, hashtag doubt. Quote, why, one contemporary newspaper account states, did the people of Kansas ever establish a medical college in a town of about 30,000 inhabitants? No medical college in such a town can by any possibility fit its students for the practice of medicine. They cannot even learn the anatomy except by robbing the neighboring graveyards, end quote. Slide, please. In December 1895, a mere 5 years after its inaugural class, the body, to borrow a particular idiom, was out of the bag, or coffin, as the case was. On December 8th, 1895, a Topeka man buried his wife in a local cemetery. According to later newspaper reports, the man's spider sense was tingling, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he thought that all was not well with the grave. And the next day, the widower and his friends went to speak to the sexton at the cemetery, concerned that someone had interfered with his wife's remains. Despite the sexton's assurances, the man insisted, and finally the sexton took them to the grave to show them that all was well, and indeed it looked like it was undisturbed. Still, the widower was not convinced, so the sexton offered to dig down into the grave to prove his point. However, he had only gotten a foot down in the loose soil when he came across the lid of the coffin. For the record, that is not where that was supposed to be. They dug down farther into the grave and discovered that his wife had indeed been removed from her coffin. The widow's spidey sense tingled again, and he said he suspected his wife's body could be found at the medical school. I'm kind of starting to wonder at this point if the husband was indeed a psychic, or if he knew a little bit more about the grave robbing industry than he let on to the sexton. Regardless, the widower secured a search warrant, and he and his group of friends went to the medical school later that night. Lo and behold, they entered the dissection room where the students were hard at work, and when the doctor in charge lifted the sheet to reveal the subject's face, the widower screamed, "My God, it's my wife," before fainting. Upon further investigation, the bodies of 2 more women who had also recently been buried in local cemeteries were discovered at the college. A student who also worked as a janitor for the school was arrested. By December 18th, 5 more people were arrested, including a known scavenger, 3 students, and the president of the college. The latter 4, the students and the president, were eventually cleared of charges, but the janitor and the scavenger were sentenced to prison terms. Since body snatching was a misdemeanor in Kansas at the time, their sentences were most likely limited to a year or 2 in jail and possibly a fine. Public outcry against the crimes was great, and there was a concern when the news first broke that a mob would come to destroy the medical college. It was not unheard of. There had been riots around these issues in the past in other cities. However, while many reputations were ruined in the affair, the president of the college ended up packing up and leaving town because his life was basically destroyed by the scandal. The medical college survived, at least for a while. The local cemeteries, however, increased their security after the events of December 1895. The medical school itself eventually became part of Washburn University. Slide, please. So there is much more that could be said about this subject. Research continues today into the profound social implications of body snatching, especially into the effect it had on Black communities. But body snatching was just a small part of the journey of the body after death in 19th century America. So in conclusion, the intense psychological strain of grief and loss suffered by the Civil War generation endured throughout the post-war years. Nearly half of the Civil War dead remained unidentified at the end of the war. To the survivors, this compounded the sense of loss and uncertainty, which disrupted both the complex mourning rituals practiced in the 19th century, and for Americans, it shook their belief in the good death. For a soldier who was missing and presumed dead, the family were left wondering, what meaning did his life have since his narrative was incomplete? The physical destruction the war caused on bodies left the survivors also wondering about the value of the soul in the face of such destruction. It was, as Drew Gilpin Faust wrote, quote, death without dignity, death without decency, death without identity imperiled the meaning of the life that had preceded it. So, end quote. The war irrevocably altered the survivors' understanding of themselves. And as Civil War diarist Kate Stone wrote in 1864, quote, death does not seem half so terrible as it did long ago. We have grown used to it, end quote. Slide, please. That is it. Thank you so much for listening and attending. And I hope we have some time for questions. And again, apologies for the slideshow. Oopsie, in the beginning.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. That was something else. We do have quite a few questions here. Let me get our view sorted out. Okay, perfect. Well, I guess first off, what got you interested in this topic? Because it's pretty unique.
I will be honest, I actually hated the Civil War until about 10 or 12 years ago. I really disliked studying it. I'm an early colonialist. I love the beginning of the founding of our country. The Civil War to me was dirty. There were too many, movements of the armies, cannons and like machine gun fire or rapid fire weapons. I mean, that's just not for me. I didn't jive with it. And then in graduate school, I had a professor, Sarah Connor, and Sarah Connor, that's from the Terminator. Sarah Cornell. Wow. Dr. Cornell, she had a couple courses on both American slavery and just the impact of the Civil War on America and the society that came out of that. And that really intrigued me because we are a direct result of the Civil War period, and the issues that they faced at the time are obviously still very relevant today. So you'll notice that I quoted from Dr. Faust quite frequently. Her book Republic of Suffering was really instrumental, among other sources, in creating this talk. So definitely recommend it for anyone interested in this topic. But I just felt it was appropriate for the season.
Absolutely, it is. Ethan asks, how popular were death masks in the 19th century? Were these strictly reserved for great men like Napoleon, Lincoln, Benito Juarez, etc.?
So death masks were popular. Again, there was definitely a social demarcation line. Only the upper class would be able to afford these kind of things. As maybe some people in the audience know, people like George Washington at the end of the 18th century, turning of the 19th, had death masks made in order to, spread the image, create this idea of an American hero. They were popular to some extent in the 19th century, but perhaps not as popular as they had been in times past.
Do you know if it like how difficult it was to like actually maneuver corpses out of graves? Like how quickly does rigor mortis set in? Like, are these bodies like very, very stiff?
Rigor mortis can set in even up to 2 hours after death. The body becomes quite stiff, literally cannot be moved. But remember, the funeral had to happen. Death had to be, confirmed. You don't want to bury someone alive. By the time the body got into the ground, it should have started to loosen up a bit. So it should have been quite pliable to kind of twist and turn it out of the grave. Not to mention, if you break a bone, I mean, the person is not going to be screaming in pain. So
yes, that's true.
yeah, I imagine the weight would probably be the biggest thing, and trying to keep everything quiet. You did not want anyone coming across your illicit activities. There were definitely stories of grave robbers. They're halfway through, someone comes in with the light and they're just running, hopping fences, trying to get away. So it was probably very funny in a very sick, sad, scary way.
You kind of touched on it a little bit. Another question we had is how did the mourning process change throughout American history?
Well, I mean, it depends on what cultural group you're talking about. For upper and middle class Americans, you see this gradual removal of the body from, well, I mean, not just upper and middle class, but nowadays even the body becomes, property of a hospital. You're removed from the home. A lot of people don't die at home anymore. Obviously, some people still do on hospice, but the idea that death has become kind of commodified, it is monitored, it's a very sterile process. There is kind of a removal for a lot of Americans now to go through kind of a sanitized process of grieving and mourning. So you're, in the hospital and then you leave. But in many traditional cultures, in Irish cultures, for example, you would sit up with the body all night and have a wake and observe the deceased in their passing to the next life. If you're talking about indigenous and native peoples during the 19th century, especially, they were torn from the graves of their loved ones when they were forced to move across the country, and they were robbed of that place and home. So it's a very broad topic, but I think the best answer for at least the majority of Americans now is there has been an increased removal from death, and we just don't know it as personally as someone in the 19th century would have, when death was much more common. Infant mortality was very high. If you lived past your teens, you had a pretty good chance of survival, unless you were a soldier in the Civil War. But yes, they were very, very intimate with death in a way that we are not now.
Great answer. Okay, we've got one from YouTube here. My brother-in-law's had a hair sculpture, or maybe a hair wreath, display of the departed on the wall. Oh, was that sort of thing common? A hair sculpture display.
A hair sculpture display, yeah. So I don't know how many people would have actually displayed hair in their homes, but it was very common to keep a piece of hair as a memento from even a living person, living or deceased. I didn't put this in the text, but when Lord Nelson or Admiral Nelson was killed, they actually took his hair off at his wife's request so that she could keep it. And it was not uncommon for people to cut locks of hair from famous people after their death and sell them surreptitiously. For example, George Washington, they were the first president, they were very concerned that people would be coming in and snipping his hair as they viewed the body. So they were keeping a close eye on that. And also, I think it was just a few years ago, well, maybe a couple of decades now, that they found locks of, I believe, Beethoven's hair, and they went for quite a bit at auctions. So keeping hair was certainly a practice that seems a little strange and gross to us today, but for them, in the period kind of before the cell phone and really before the spread of photography and TV and media, it was a way of keeping your loved one close to you. It was a piece of them, and definitely held up better than, say, taking an ear or something.
This may be a little out of your expertise, but did the Napoleonic Wars have as great of an impact on the practices surrounding death as the American Civil War had? Great question.
That is a really great question. And the Napoleonic Wars covered so much territory in Europe. I'm sorry, I'm an Americanist. I'm not the greatest person to answer that question. I would say that they probably did, especially if you were in an area where the armies were moving through. There would have been a lot of death, and not just death from the battlefield, but the mortality that comes with armies moving, and disease, and the destruction that armies can cause on the landscape. But the American Civil War was really special in a terrifying way, for the way that for 4 years the entire country was wrapped up in this tumultuous, horrifically violent, unprecedented experience that, like I said in the presentation, turned everything on its head. One of the diarists that I read said, nothing is the same. We are different people than we were before. They were very much aware that they had changed as a result of the war, especially in the South. I don't think that there were very many people at all who could have said that they escaped the war. Physically, they would have been caught up in the Union armies moving south. They would have, almost every household had lost someone. It was really an earth-shattering, culturally shattering event. And that's only talking about the Civil War. Obviously, like I said, there are so many other cultural groups that we could discuss. The idea of immigrants coming to this country and dying and being separated from their loved ones back home, enslaved people who didn't maybe have a choice in what their death practice would have looked like, or trying to carve some agency out of this horrible scenario that they're in. Indigenous peoples who were removed from their homelands and removed from the bodies of their ancestors. So I can talk at length about the American experience, but I'm sorry, coming back to the question, I'm not as good in European history.
Well, no, thank you. Did we see any change in like artwork or the words that were engraved on tombstones over time?
So absolutely, yeah. The artwork, for one, there was a really wonderful exhibit. I think it was put out by the Smithsonian maybe 10, 15 years ago on the artwork of the Civil War, and just the changes that took place in kind of recognizing the scope and the landscape of the war. I mean, when you're thinking about landscape, of course, we have the world wars where the countryside was basically destroyed, but very similar things happened in the Civil War. And the art definitely reflects that, especially in photography, and this kind of popular advent of the camera, going out there, people taking photos of the battlefield. This was really an inaugural time for war photography. People back home had never seen anything like that before, and it kind of shook them. Their core beliefs were shaken to the very core at being presented with death in such in a very real way. So
a lot of this talk has kind of been couched in the past. Do we have any good idea if these practices continue today, maybe for less lucrative means, maybe? Yeah, any instances of this being reported like more recently?
Yeah, I mean, you have your urban legends of the builders in Hungary who go into the country of Hungary, who go into a house and they find a barrel in the basement, take a few swigs, realize it's pretty good, and then open it up to discover, it's someone's husband who's been put in liquor and, intended to be taken back to the home country. I think it was Jamaica in the story, to avoid the processing charges for shipping a corpse overseas. But you do see those stories. As for actual like body snatching, there are places in the world where body snatching is still relatively common, especially for religious observations. I don't remember exactly what religion it was, but I want to say that there were monks involved. I don't believe it was a Christian religion, but there were monks involved who were paying to get skeletons because they thought that, they could use the thigh bones to as a musical instrument, and they thought that there was a very special religious component in drinking out of a skull. So there are definitely all over the world people who are still stealing bodies for different reasons, and obviously for medical colleges as well. And I would assume, I don't know the statistics of how many people actually give their bodies over to science, but I imagine that it is still probably somewhat of an issue, because we still have remnants of the good death that have come down to us. We don't believe in just handing our body over to be harvested, even though that would really further the science. But it just goes against our core cultural beliefs, which is something that we're still kind of working on.
We got a few questions left this evening. I know this might be further into the 19th century, but I've read of secret societies using real human skeletons for whatever reasons. I'm assuming they also got those via grave robbing.
I would assume, I'm sorry, I know almost nothing about secret societies other than that George Washington was a member of one. Some of my colleagues are probably laughing right now because I keep saying George Washington. But I would imagine that it's the case, but I don't want to say definitively. I'm sorry, I know very little about that.
I have read stories about like a certain fraternity having what they claim to be William Quantrill's skull. So I'm sure there's probably a lot of accounts of crazy things like that.
Yeah, I tried to make the talk humorous, but I mean, in reality, this was a very serious thing, even for us today. So the idea of stealing someone's loved one is actually really shattering.
Pretty horrific.
Yeah, in as much as we, like I said, we have sanitized ourselves and kind of removed, and we can joke about it and we see it on TV. But yeah, especially in the 19th century, this was a very different story.
Well, thank you so much for this, Lauren. It's very fun to dive into a topic that we really don't get to talk too much about, but it's still kind of grounded in research and good old American history. So I hope everyone here can join us next month. Lauren gave a great plug. Katie Keckeisen will be pushing back the veil, taking a look behind the veil and diving into a history of spiritualism. That's next month, November 4th, but keep in mind, that's not the second Friday, it's gonna be the first Friday. So hopefully you all can be there and join us. And again, Lauren, thank you so much. And from everyone here at Museum After Hours, have a great